Right, welcome back to the next video in our API series around about the APIs and integrations no-code pillar. Now, in the previous video, I talked about what API documentation is, some of the kind of basics of reading it, and spent most of the time actually talking about something called JSON and how that works and how you can sort of use that to work with APIs. If you haven't watched that already, absolutely go and watch that first, or this video won't make much sense. In this video, we're going to talk now a little bit more broadly about actually reading API documentation and making use of it. And I'm going to show you some examples. This will then tie into the next video where I'll actually make a request using this documentation. But I thought it made some sense to talk through it in more detail first before we then put it into practice. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to look at a few different kind of types of documentation, but the first one I'm going to focus on is Webflow. And the reason for that is we've previously looked at Webflow on our UI and UX pillar. You might not have watched that yet, but if not, it's worth checking that out, especially on the repeating data lists and the repeating data list demo, which I obviously did on Webflow. What you're looking at now is the demo. So I kind of, essentially I've got a bunch of blog posts here. I made a list of blog posts that I can click into. I can see the title, etc. And that is all powered off the back of what Webflow calls its CMS. CMS stands for Content Management System, and it's just a fancy way of saying a database specifically for content. So if I click over here, it's going to show me Webflow's database. And by the way, sorry if you haven't seen Webflow yet, because maybe you've not seen the other videos. Webflow is a tool for building websites and to some extent web apps. It's really fully featured. It lets you do a bunch of different design stuff without code. Obviously it lets you have this content database as well, so you can do a lot of really cool stuff with it. The NoCode.Tech website that you are watching this on is built on Webflow. Everything that you see on there is Webflow. So we've got this CMS collection. A CMS collection is just another word for a database table. And if we click in there, and let me just start to kind of minimize myself now and get me off the screen. We've got all these different blog posts, and within these blog posts we then have we've got different fields, a bit like database fields, excuse me, but we've got a name, we've got a URL, we've got a post body, we've got a post summary, a main image, a thumbnail, color, featured, so on and so forth. And that featured is just a boolean or a switch, as Webflow calls it. So, all sorts of different stuff in there, but it's just a basic database of content. Hopefully that makes some sense. So clearly the CMS sits on Webflow. You have kind of access to the database in terms of clicking around it, but just like Airtable, just like Google Sheets, just like every other no-code database out there, quite often you're going to want to access that by API, because if you access it by API, you can programmatically push information into it, take it out of it, etc. Without having to actually write that in yourself. If you want a user to click something on Webflow and have that insert information into a collection, into blog posts, into an item, then you have to use the API to do that. So what you're looking at here is the very start of the Webflow API reference, API documentation, whatever you want to call it. It is the equivalent of a user manual, essentially. And almost every company that has an API has this type of website. It looks like this, it works like this. Typically you've got the navigation on the left, you've got the explainer on the right, and then as you'll see in a minute, we then have a sort of example like API calls on the complete kind of black right hand side menu there. So what I really want you to get out of this, you're not going to understand everything because this is intended for programmers, but what I want you to be able to do from reading this is just to be able to get in and kind of understand the basics of what the API does and sort of how it works, and not so much for Webflow, although clearly you're going to get that, but more just about how you can dive into any API and quickly pick things out and be able to use it without having to understand every option or understand it like a programmer, because the real aim here as a no-coder is to just know enough to be dangerous rather than completely understanding it inside out, because often no-code means you don't need to do that. And when you get to the point that your app is big enough and ugly enough that you're going to need someone to help with it, you're probably going to have enough money from your customers to make that happen, no problem. So let's talk a little bit, first of all, about the data hierarchy. Quite a lot of API documentation references will point this out for you, some won't, but an API really is just, especially a REST API, is really just a way of accessing data. Sometimes it's accessing a service, but typically it's a way of accessing data. And so what an API will do is it will expose each data table that's available to you as an individual API, and then let you, do the 4 operations we talked about: get, post, put, delete, to get different data. So on Webflow, the first table is a website, or a site as Webflow calls it, and then within each site you can have one or multiple collections. So this here is a site, this here is a collection. If I hit this button, then I could add a new collection in. Let's say offers, there's a template, hit create collection. So blog posts is one collection, offers is one collection there as well, and I can add 10 items and it'll add a bunch of stuff in there for me. So if I go back to my Webflow CMS reference, within a collection, such as blog posts, I then have different items, and within those items I have a field. Let's go back and relate that. Well, this is our collection. Each of these blog posts here is an item, 15 best blogs, yada, yada, yada. And then if I pop in, things like name, slug, post body, main image, post summary, those are all items. So quickly, this makes sense to us. Okay, we've got a site, okay, we've got a collection, we've got an item, we've got a field. Now, here is one of the most critical points of information. Excuse me, I've got a bit of a cough today. I have been filming for 10 days straight. So, one of the most critical bits of information you need to know is every single item, every single collection or blog post, and every single site has what we call a unique identifier. We've talked a little bit about these before, but a unique identifier is just typically a random collection of letters and numbers. It will look just like an API authentication key actually, but a bit shorter, and it uniquely identifies that particular collection because, I've got a collection called blog posts. I could easily, I bet there are millions of Webflow customers who have got collections called blog posts. So Webflow just gives it a unique identity, which means you don't have to remember the name. You don't have to worry about, was it blog posts with an apostrophe? Was it a capital letter? You simply have this unique identifying string. And then every item within that has this unique string as well. Let me show you it. If I pop in here and let's go back to this, blog post, 10 great examples of responsive websites. Here we go, an item ID. This is what it looks like. It's just this unique little string here, or little piece of text. It's just unique, 6051, yada, yada, yada. I could go in here and it'll be something similar, but different. That's different. Look at the end, 27C5. If I go back up there, 82A0. So it'll just generate these really kind of unique IDs, and that is where things get important, because quite often to figure out where you are in an API, you've got to navigate it, is what I call it. And essentially, imagine you basically looked up, you've got your account. To navigate it, you're going to look up a list of all of your sites, and that's going to give you each site in a unique ID. So you pick the site you want. In this case for us, it's going to be NoCode Demo. So we're saying, okay, well, let's take NoCode Demo's unique ID. And now that we've got that unique ID, let's take that and look for the collection unique ID. So we look up our collections list, and we've got a few there under that site ID. So under that site ID, the collections are the blog post and the offers collections. So we go, okay, well, the blog post unique string is 12345, and the offers one is 75360. Now that we've got them, we can choose which one to use. We take the offers one, so we then go into the site, which is 1234. We're going to the blog post collection, which is 56789, and then we look at each item, and each item has a unique ID, and we can get the individual details from there. A field does not have a unique ID, but an item does. So let's start to look through the different kind of, I guess the the options that Webflow has, if you want to call them that. Technically, you would call them, resources, etc. But I'm going to call them options. Now, there's a couple of things that we're going to talk about. So, first of all, we just want to have a quick look at authentication. Whenever you work with an API, you want to have a look at the authentication bit because it's generally going to be a little bit different. There are various different ways you can authenticate. You can use OAuth, which essentially lets you authenticate via your user. OAuth stands for Open Authentication. It's how you do sign in with Facebook, sign in with Google. So if you wanted to sign in to Facebook as a user to get their information, you would use OAuth. Now, that's pretty tricky, but there is a company or a no-code tool called PathFix, pathfix.com, and they essentially do that for you. So you just use their integration that lets you connect into all these different APIs. A bunch of other tools like Bubble, etc. have this built in. Xano's got it built in as well. But quite often you'll just have an API key, and then you have what we call typically a bearer token. Bearer being you, token being the token that you are now bearing as your form of security. It's like a password. So you would just pass that, you would just kind of use that. So things starting to get a little bit complicated already. Let's take a little bit of a look at what we mean. So when you work with an API, typically that API is going to give you what we call the base URL. The base URL is just almost a website kind of address where that API is held. Typically it's going to be api.thecompany.com, so api.google.com, api.facebook, and of course in this case we've got api.webflow.com. Now on the right we have our first code example. When you look at an API reference, you're going to see a bunch of what we call SDKs. That stands for Software Development Kit, and essentially, depending on if you're a programmer, depending on what language you're using, be it JavaScript, .NET, if you don't know them, they're just programming languages. There's all sorts of different ones, JavaScript being the most popular. Depending on which one you use, the SDK will let you code that API in a certain way. That's going to be really specific. We do not want to look at that. What we want to look at is going to be called either curl, C-U-R-L, or it's going to be called shell. Now, technically, curl is actually C-U-R-L, but curl is what we'll call it. And curl is just this kind of like, it's a thing that programmers use. Every single computer has it, and it lets you kind of essentially just connect to an API. It is an API tool. The reason we're going to look at it is because it just happens to spell out the information that we need in very simple terms. So an API, as we've talked about, has a base URL, it has an authentication token, it has parameters. The other thing that we haven't talked about are headers. Now we could explain headers. They're essentially, they're kind of like meta information. They're kind of like wee extra information you give to the API that's not really about the specific request you're making, but is more just about telling the API like how you want to receive the information and that kind of thing. It's very different from parameters because a parameter is actually saying, I want this data specifically, whereas a header is saying something like, send me back the response in JSON, or send me back the response as if I was a mobile user or a web user. You're almost never going to have to use headers like that. They get really complicated, but typically there are a few kind of defaults that an API just needs. You can almost see this as a challenge of how to, it's almost like a secret handshake for getting in. So we have an example down here. See what it says H. If we look at this little curl box, right next to the word curl, we've got a URL. That is the base URL. And that's the one we're going to continually use, api.webflow.com. We then have this thing that says -H. Whenever you read that, it means there is a header. Typically the headers are generic, they're not variables, they're just something that you copy and paste straight in. When you actually come to use an API tool, which we will do on our make a request video, where I'll actually implement that Webflow request, you'll see this, but typically you'll have a bunch of boxes. They work exactly like key value pairs. You put in the header name, which in this case is content type, and then you put in the value, which is application/JSON. You'll see that this looks exactly like the JSON that we did before. Clearly they've missed a quotation mark there. That's just the way curl works. All this stuff is just a little bit different, but when you actually go and put this into a API tool, you'll simply put the header name in, which will be this key, which is content type, and then you'll put the value in, which is application/JSON. Typically, they'll have a few. So Webflow has another one you've got to type in, which the key is accept version, and then the value is 1.0.0, because you essentially have to tell Webflow which version of their API you want to use. Do you want to use the most up-to-date one, which is 1.0.0? Do you want to use an out-of-date one for 0.7.0? The reason you would do that, by the way, is because you're going to, whenever you call Webflow's API from your app, you want it to work. If Webflow bring out a new version, you don't want your app to suddenly break in the middle of the night because the API is now different. So you tell it what version you want, and it's always going to answer you with that version. And then it's up to you later if you want to upgrade your code or your no code to use their new version. You can do that, but you don't have to. And typically, if an integration is in something like Zapier, or if it's kind of like done for you already in a no-code tool, you're not going to have to worry about that. So this really is kind of in some ways minutia, but that just gives you an example. If you're looking at an API, the first things you need to know about accessing it are the base URL, which shows up here, any headers, and there could be multiple that go here, and also how you send your authentication key. And typically that will be just like this. Excuse me. We will add a header that says authorization, which is a key, and then the value is bearer space the token. That's how that works for headers. Now that is all very boring, so let's go and skip into how the API actually works itself. So we're going to have a look at the first piece of actual data you would pull through the API, and you'll immediately notice there is some really familiar JSON on the side here. But when we use the phrase model in an API, what we really mean is table. What Webflow has essentially done here is give you a look at how their sites table works. So the site has a field called ID, and that is what we call an object ID, which is just a unique identifier. It's just a way of saying this is a random string, just like this one here, of numbers and letters that identify it. You remember earlier when I pointed out these IDs down here, and I said everything's got a unique identifier? This is it here. This is one example. Every single site is going to have a different one, so this is just always everything you see on here as an example. It won't be the real ID that you actually get, but it shows you how it works. So we've got a field called ID, brilliant. We've got a field called created on, which is a date field, and it's going to tell you the date that website was created. We've got the name. In our case, this is going to be no code demo, and that is a string, which if you remember is a text field. We've got the short name, which can just be sort of, that will be like where I've got no code space demo, that will be like no code hyphen demo. It's how it would show up in an actual like if I was typing it into like my web address bar. We've got the last date that I republished the site. We've got a preview URL that will basically bring back an image of what the site looks like, time zone, etc, etc. So you've got all this information. Now if you remember back to a drawing that I did on the API slides, I talked about this idea of resources. Every table is a resource, and on every resource you can clearly do get, you can do post, you can do put, you can do delete. There's another one that Webflow mentioned called patch. It kind of just does the same as a put. It just lets you update data. So and yeah, as a quick reminder, get is how you read or retrieve data. Post is how you create a new record. Put is how you update an existing record, and delete is how you delete a record. You will see put and patch, they both essentially do the same thing, but use whichever one the API requests. Now, when you do a get, there are two things that you can do. You can either list every record, or you can list a specific record. So we see this request here, it says api.webflow.com, so that's the base URL or the base address of the API, and then we do /sites, and that is essentially when we send an API call to that, what we are saying is give me everything that you've got in the sites table or the sites resource. So that is going to return to you every Webflow site that you've got in your account. It knows it's your account because you have sent your authorization token. So it's going to say, okay, who does that token match? Right, it matches Niall. What's he got in his account? Okay, let's see, and there we go. So essentially when you do that, That's going to bring back, as I say, all the information about your sites. If you've got multiple, then it's just going to show you all this information here, but with different site information in it. So it might be, name, site number 1, and then you might have an ID and a time zone, etc. And then you might have site number 2, so on and so forth. So that will just bring you back a bunch of objects. So what you would do is your request would look like that. It would be api.webflow.com/sites. You would have your authorization in. Remember I said Webflow has this other header, accept version? Well, that's it there. And then this is what you would get back if you sent that. You would get all this information. Now, we're going to do that in the next video. It's a pretty exciting feeling when you send your first API call and get information back. You suddenly feel like you're hacking the matrix kind of thing, especially when it's black and green text like this. But essentially, because you can have lots of different records, you could have 10 sites, you could have 100 sites, it's going to bring each one back as a unique object. So you see how we've got our JSON here, the object, the site object is contained in there. Remember, an object is just a word for the table or the record, it's just a word for here's a group of data. So here would be all the data about one site, here would be all the data about another site, so on and so forth. We can see the commas telling us there's multiple objects. We can see there's a comma, key value, comma, key value, comma, so on and so forth. So, to the untrained eye, when you look at that kind of looks quite scary, but actually, now that you're starting to read a little bit about JSON and starting to look at that, it's probably going to start to make some sense. Okay, so if I take a real glance, well, this is just the name of the website, so it's not that confusing. And this big string here, well, this is just the published date. And there's just the date it was published, and the reason it's got a Z in it, by the way, that's like it's one of the date formats. It does like nanoseconds or something. I don't really understand it. I've never really had to use seconds before. If you do feel you have to use it, I'd really double check that. Do you really need it? Consider if you can just use like minutes and hours. That's a bit easier. But anyway, so you can start to see all this kind of information here. And if you're ever looking at that going, what the hell is a last published date? Just scroll up to here, because it's going to tell you it's the date the site was last published. So that's kind of how that works. So if you want to just get a list of all of the specific sites, then that's how you do it. And that is importantly going to give you the unique ID. So if I want to look up this site in particular, rather than all of these, I can grab this ID here and I can copy that, because what we're going to look at next is how you get a specific site. So if you want to only get one record, or in this case one specific Webflow site, then you are going to do the base URL, api.webflow.com. You want to go to the sites resource, so you're going to do /sites, and then you're going to do slash and the unique identifier. So I'm going to type in sites, /58036, whatever it is. I'm just going to type that in, and that is going to return only the information for that specific record. So if I want to look up a specific record, that is how I do it. Look at the difference there. There I've listed all of them. There I've listed one of them. Now this is really, really important, because you can do this on every single API. Every single API out there has the ability to get all of the data. You can then read all of that data. You can pick the one you want. You can send another API call that's got the specific ID for the record you want more information on, and you can dive into it. Now, in this particular example, Webflow has included all the information when you've listed it of each site, but typically if you go into a specific one on other APIs, you'll be able to get a lot more information. The thing to bear in mind here, the way to think about this is, we're talking about how we would kind of manually explore this. Quite often, you are not going to be the person working with this API, it's your app that's going to be doing it. And so, where we've got a list here and then an exact response, from a specific site, what this might actually look like in your app is a repeating data list. This here might look exactly like might look like this. It might be repeating bits of information. I'll show you a better example of that when we actually come to look at the blog posts. But essentially, you have to, this is just data that you can take and then use in your app however you want. Your user's not going to ever know there's an ID. They're not ever going to worry about a published date or anything like that. They're just going to, that information is just going to come through to your workflows, to your backend, to your database, and you are going to choose how you use that on your on your website itself, so, or on your app. So if you ever wanted to just have a list of all your Webflow sites for some reason, I don't know what you might be making, you would just pull that through and then you would save that to a variable, to a database, and then you would show that on the front end. Again, don't worry too much about that at the minute. I'll give you a better example shortly. So there's all sorts of things you can do there for sites, and you can take actions like you can, tell the site to be published, etc. I'll let you explore that on your own, because let's pop into something a little bit more interesting. Now, as we said, a collection is just essentially a database table. So, this is one collection, this is another collection, etc., etc. Now, let's look at our model again. So we've got a bunch of stuff this time. This is a bit more complex. We've got some general information like the ID. That's really important. What's the ID of this collection? We've got the last time the data collection was updated, when it was created, the name of it, is it blog posts, is it offers, etc. A bunch of stuff. We also have fields, and fields is an array. You might remember when we talked about data types, an array is a list. So in other words, this is saying, if you ask me, this is the API talking, if you ask me for a collection, I am going to give you back all of that information plus an array of all the fields. Let's have a quick look at what some of the fields are again. If I hit this settings button, I'm going to be able to explore the fields that I've got. So I've got a name field, I've got a post body, I've got a post summary, main image, thumbnail, and each of those has a type, just like a database. I've got plain text, I've got an image, I've got rich text, I've got color, I've got a switch. Switch is just another name for a Boolean. And so, okay, we understand the fields from the visual perspective. If I now look at what this collection actually has, now this is going to show me a bunch of, it kind of says, check the full fields section. We have a different part of the API that talks about the fields. So, as we go into field types, you've got, it'll tell you like what type of data it is, what it's called, etc. But we've got a switch that we talked about. That's a Boolean field, that's a yes, no. We've got the color, which is a string because it's just holding the hex value. We've got an image, which is just going to have the unique ID for the image, so on and so forth. So this will tell you, plain text, that field that we looked at, that was called plain text, well, we now know that's a string, which is just a form of text. So this will tell you exactly what each image type comes out as, what the field types are like, and what their kind of data types are. Let's click back to collections. So again, we can do a couple of things here. We can list all of the collections. So imagine at this point we've already got our site ID, and then we want to have a look at different collections within that. So we can put our site ID in there, just like the example here, and we can then look up the various different collections. And that's just going to give us back very similar information to last time, except now you can see it's pulling through things like blog posts, offers, etc. Stuff that we might have in our own Webflow demo. The fact that that is bringing up the same stuff as I've got on my website is pure coincidence, by the way. I've done it that way. This isn't actually pulling the example information from my website. It just happens to be the same collections. So it's kind of really just the same thing, much in the way that it took us 5 minutes there to learn about how sites work. We can now immediately see how collections work. It's just a further extension to this base URL. So okay, we looked at sites. Now let's dive into the sites and look at the collections that are part of that site. And really, you kind of just follow the relationship. So once you've picked your site, you then go into all the collections related to that site. So that's what this is listing. And then I can take the ID for that specific collection I want to view. And then I can go in here and I can get the collection with full schema. What that means is get the collection with all the field types attached. And so if I look at my base URL, I've went to the API, I've went into collections, and I have looked up the specific collection ID. Again, this is going to be completely unique across all of Webflow. I'm just looking, straight at the collections and getting the information. I could also go to the site / the unique ID / the collection / the unique ID, but that's starting to get a little bit confusing. We don't need to do that because every resource, every table stands alone. So as long as you've got a unique record ID for that table, you can go in and look it up and go from there. So if we kind of look at this example here, you know, what we're starting to see is we've got all the basic information on the right. Now this is again, if you went and asked for a specific collection, if I went and asked for a blog post, this is what I'm going to get back. It's going to tell me, you know, what kind of how essentially almost how the collection is set up, like how does that database set up. So, you know, what's it called, you know, what kind of fields have we got in there, right? We've got post body, we know about that, we've got post summary, we've got main image, you know, image is an image type obviously, post summary is plain text, post body is rich text, you know, this is all stuff that we've seen before. Now there might be data types here that we didn't discuss because every no-code tool is going to have its own kind of data types. You know, if you think this is bad, wait till you see Glide, they've got some crazy stuff in there. But a lot of them are really common. Text we already know about, you know, a boolean we already know about, you know, a colour, although it says colour in Webflow, it is just text. This is how you can start to get all that different API information out and have a read at it. Now you're not going to need everything, you know, you might not need to know if it's editable, if it's required, but you don't have to use every bit of information. You can pick and choose, you could take one key value out of this whole thing if you wanted to. It's entirely up to you. One little point of notation to point out here, it's quite interesting. See where this says fields and then you've got a square bracket rather than a curly bracket. A square bracket is saying it's a way of denoting an array. So if you want to start an array rather than another object, you can use a square bracket. And an array will basically just be filled with objects, and all objects will be the same. They'll have the same value, same keys, maybe different values, but have a look at this, right? Look in closer detail. So we've opened an array. Immediately within that array we have this object. It looks like that. You know, immediately as we start to go down, now you've got this extra bit, you don't always, you know, it's always going to be exactly the same, but immediately as we go down these ones, you know, this looks the same, this looks the same, okay, I might have a couple of extra fields here and there, but they all kind of broadly look the same, and you can have one, or you could have, you know, I think Webflow can go up to 60 fields, so you could have one in that array, or you could have 60, but the important part is, these are just little repeating bits, and you make it an array because you don't know if you're going to get one field back or if you're going to get 60. So by making it an array, your no-code app, is when it gets it back, is going to expect to receive a list, and it's going to know, okay, the list could have one thing or could have 10 things. Because it's getting it as an array, it can count how many things are in the list, it can put it through a loop and see what it does. But you'll notice right as we get to the very end, you know, we get to this last object in the array, and once it's finished, we've got a square bracket again that finishes an array, and then after that we've got our last curly bracket that finishes the whole object. So that's just an idea of how arrays work, but that's really powerful. Now that's only given us the information about the collection, it's not given us the items within the collection. So let's look at that as one last example on Webflow. So essentially every blog post, every offer that we've got in our two collections count as an item. Let's have a quick look at the item model. So there's a few pieces of data here we can check. We've got a field that says, is archived? That's a boolean, it'll be a yes or no. Yes, it's archived, no it's not. Is it a draft? Yes it is, no it isn't. What's the name of it? What's the URL? When was it updated? When was it published? Etc. And essentially what we can do is, again, we can do this get request. Get is, by the way, the most common request you'll do, just because it's saying give me information. So what I can do is I can go to the collection on my base URL, which I'm seeing here. I can put the collection ID in, which I've already got my previous API call, and then I can look up the items, and that is going to bring back every item. Again, let's look at it on the kind of code example. You're just putting in this base URL collection / yada 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 right through to items, and you can even set a limit there, by the way. Anything after a question mark is what we call a query string. Quite often, instead of sending parameters on a GET request, you'll actually use a query string, which is when you just put a question mark, and then you basically type in your keys and your values. So limit is the key, equals 1, which is a value. You could then do a little kind of ampersand sign and do more. I'll show you what that looks like. You can do something like this. So I can do like limit equals 1, and you know, sort equals A to Z, and you know, collection equals blog blog post. You can do it, you can type it up kind of like that. Typically though, whatever tool you're using to make an API will do that automatically for you. It'll ask you for parameters, and then if it is a get where you've got to use a query string, it will do that, so don't worry about it too much. And again, I know this is getting really complex. I know that you're getting to the point where you're like, what is this guy talking about? We'll kind of bring it to life a little bit in the next video and sort of make a little bit more sense. But this is, you've got to remember, this is the kind of thing that programmers study for months and months and months, and sometimes even go to university or an expensive dev bootcamp to learn. So anything that you can pick up is already putting you miles ahead. You don't need to know every last detail like a programmer does. You just need to get comfortable playing with it, because if you can get comfortable playing with it, the aim of the game with no code is just to dive in and start using it willy-nilly. So this is how we would get all items, and again, you're probably starting to get the gist here, but we've got our items response from the API as soon as we send that query there with our authentication token or version header. Immediately we're getting items. We've got an array there. For every item, it's going to tell us, is it archived, is it draft, is it featured, what's the name of it, what's the post body, all the different fields that we've got. It will just return them, so I can immediately access all of that blog post information by API and do whatever I like with it. Obviously for every item I've got a unique ID, just like that. Not like that one, sorry, that's not it, that was the ID of the main image. For every blog item I've got this unique ID. On Webflow, the CID is a collection ID, so I always know this is an item's ID and this is a collection that item is part of, that's its ID as well. So if I ever want to find this, come back and grab this item, I can do that. Or if I want to simply, let's say I want to update a collection item. So let's say I want to change the post name or something else in it. I can essentially do a put request. Now so far we've looked at a get request, but a put is what's going to let us update an existing item. So you go to api.webflow.com/collections/the collection ID /items/the item ID. So we've said we want to update this collection, and within that collection, this is a specific item we want to update. Here's our authentication token. Here is another header we've got to put in. Here's another header we've got to put in. If you're wondering how do you know what headers you've got to put in, look at the example and essentially copy it. If it says you've got to put this header in here, put it in. If it says you've got to put accept version in, put it in. Just copy whatever's there already. If you're wondering how the hell do I put headers in, what am I even putting it into, we'll look at some API tools in the next video. Those API tools will always have a place that says headers. You put it in as the header and it takes it from there. Now data binary is just a fancy way of saying parameters. When you look in your own API tool, you will use parameters or key value pairs. You will not use data binary. You will always use key value pairs or parameters. So essentially what we're doing here is we've just put in a nice little set of parameters. Hopefully your API tool will take it in as a key value pair. It will convert that into the JSON kind of look here that it's got all by itself, but you would just put a parameter that says name. You put in updated exciting blog post title. You might put in a colour, for example, as a key, and then put here's the new hex code I want to use, and then take a look at this offer. So this says offer, and you'd expect to see something like, I don't know, Niall Frater, John Smith, Rachel Adams, whatever. But actually what you get is this ID, and the reason is, one of the things that you can do, if you think about on a database, you're going to have a relationship field. So for example, on a blog post, I might have a relationship with offers, because I might want to relate it to an offers own, the offers table in the database. So rather than put the name, if I already know the unique ID of that offer item, I can put that in here, and that is going to let me update the relationship. Now this is where APIs get insanely powerful, because you can take every unique ID that you've got. If there's a different piece of data with a field that links to that or relates to that, you can use the API to essentially create that relationship. So this, we're not saying the offer is 580E640, so on and so forth. We are saying if you want to find the record of the offer, this is the ID number that you need. So that is just kind of how that works, and the way Webflow, so let me show you actually. When I go to Webflow, right, and I set up a blog post and I put a field in, I can add a new field. I can select the type, so you get a reference field, and so if I want to make this the author, I can pick the collection, so that the collection it links to is already pre-made in the field. So I'll save that, and now it will look for an author. And if I go and let me save those changes, sorry. If I now go to the blog post and try to add an author in, what it's going to do is let me pick all the authors which are in this authors table. Now, because this is visual, this is the end app. You know, Webflow's API is powering this app, so I'm a user for Webflow. I am not going to see the API strings. What I'm instead going to see is simply, you know, a screen where I can pull through all of the names. All this is done, by the way, when I clicked this, essentially what happened is that API said get the authors collection and list all of the name fields. So this here is essentially just a visual representation of doing get all items for a collection. See how you've got name, obviously this is for blog posts rather than offers, but see how you've got name, etc. Well, that is just the API version of this. So I can pick an author, and I clearly pick that visually, but under the hood, Webflow knows, who have I picked, Joni Grant, Webflow knows that Joni Grant here has got this ID of 605, and just like we see in the Webflow reference, essentially they are doing a, you know, I put update the author and then put, now that's a different ID obviously because it's an example, but I would put Joni Grant's reference in there, and that would connect the two fields together. So that is an incredibly powerful piece of functionality. The other thing that you can do is you can create a collection item. Webflow's got two options. You can either publish it as in a draft, or you can publish it live. I'll just show you this one. But this is where we use post, and essentially we say, okay, we want to post a new blog post. So we're going to do that. We're going to create that new entry by going to api.webflow.com/collections/ our collection URL again /items. Now we're not going to specify a specific item because the item doesn't exist yet. We haven't created it until we send the API call. Therefore, we can't include a unique ID because it doesn't exist. So look what happens. We send the information we want to create this new blog post. We call it exciting blog post title with a name. We give it this color. We say this is the author. We say this is the post body. We say this is the post summary. By the way, that little P sign there, if you haven't seen that before, it's something you can do in rich text. A P just means a paragraph. That's completely separate. It's not really no code. Tools like WordPress, etc. have been using it for a very long time. It's called a HTML tag. You can just Google like how does rich text work with HTML tags, and it'll show you. It doesn't really matter. Just as an aside, in case you were confused and thought it was something to do with the API, it's not. So we could just send all this information to the collection, and what will happen is the API will receive that information. It will create that new blog post, and then it will come back and it's going to confirm back all the blog post details, like, okay, you wanted the name to be exciting blog title, well here it is. You wanted the post body to be blog post contents, here it is, etc. But look what it does at the bottom. It creates a new ID because now it's created this item. It wants to tell you the ID for that item, and you can now go and look that item up. So if you wanted to absolutely confirm this new item you created existed, you could copy that. You could go get the single item again. You could go to api.webflow.com/collection/collection ID/items/the new item ID, and it would show up. And that, in a nutshell, is how APIs work. There's a bunch of other stuff you need to know, to use any API. For example, we can mess around with images here. There's a bunch of stuff that you can play with, but ultimately, those are the key concepts of how an API works. That is how you look at the various different IDs, etc., the various different resources, and combine them together. So, each API is going to have several resources. You can always list those resources. You can always read the information about a specific one. You can generally update a resource by sending whichever key value parameters to it you want to change. We'll do that in a minute. And you can generally use post to create a new item in whatever resource you're looking at. Typically, when you send an API call, you will get what we call a response code. You'll have seen some of these before. You ever been to a website and the page is not found and it says 404? Well, you didn't realise it at the time, but actually that was an API call and it came back and said not found. So there are a ton of different errors and things that can go wrong, and they all have a different code. Now the one that you are looking for is 200. Whenever you do an API call, the thing that will come back will say 200, 400, 500, whatever. If it says 200, it means request was okay. That's what it will say, and that means it worked. Programmers are a little bit humble, so instead of saying holy shit this worked, it actually just says request was okay. So 200 is what you're looking for. If you get a 200, it means the thing that you tried to do worked. It is a good sign. If you get anything else, it is not such a good sign. Now anything with a 400 in the kind of 400 range means something went wrong with your kind of API. So there's a few things that can mean. So for example, if you get 404 were not found, it means you've tried to look up a resource that wasn't there. Let's say you went to api.webflow.com/collection/123/items/123 and items, and there wasn't an item with an ID that had 123, it would come back with 404 because you've just tried to look up an ID that wasn't there. Now that can mean it wasn't there, that can mean you put the wrong ID in, it depends. Figuring that out is a tricky bit about putting together an app, and that's a bit you've got to do yourself. You can also have 401 unauthorized. That typically means either you've tried to access a resource that isn't yours. So let's say you tried to access a collection item that wasn't actually part of your website. If you tried to take my collection ID right now and tried to call it via API, you would probably get a 401 because you don't have my authentication token. So that's kind of how that bit works. You get other things like a syntax error. Syntax is just a programming name for, did you get the curly brackets and the commas and shit in the right place? So if your JSON is wrong or typed wrong, you'll get a syntax error. Again, the chances are you're going to be using a tool that takes care of the JSON for you. So although you put in parameters, keys and values, you won't actually have to write it yourself, so it probably won't give you a syntax error. But the only other one worth knowing as well, is a 500. If you get anything that begins with 500, it means Webflow fucked up. It means whoever your API is, they are the ones who got it wrong. A server error, something broke on their side and it doesn't work. I mentioned, by the way, as well at the end of the API slides, sometimes you get a rate limit. A rate limit is when you basically make too many requests of an API in too short a time. How exactly is defined as too many and when is too short of a time is entirely up to the API, but you'll get what you call a rate limit there. And so just to bring all of this to life a little bit more, let's look at Stripe. Stripe essentially is an API for taking payments. I'm not going to spend too much longer on this, by the way, but Stripe is essentially an API for taking payments into your business. In fact, the chances are if you're building an app, you're almost certainly going to be using Stripe. It is the most commonly used payment provider in NoCode. It is integrated into most NoCode tools, and we even have brilliant tools on the website like Webflow or TelePay, which use Stripe to kind of power their own payments and billing service. So if you want to take money from your customers for a service, you are almost certainly going to use Stripe. The way that Stripe works is you create a charge. So you say, okay, I want to be able to charge people £40 for this product. I want to be able to charge other people £30 for this other product. You create a charge. Whenever a customer comes in to buy it, you've got to take details like their name and their address. So that creates a customer record. You would then, if a customer is going to save a card, so that becomes a card record. The card record belongs to the customer. And then what you essentially do is, whenever you want to take money from the customer, you simply relate a charge record to that customer, and Stripe takes care of the rest. So you say, okay, I've got customer John Smith over here. I've got this charge for £30. I want this charge to apply to John. Therefore, I'm taking £30 off of him. On your interface, he will have approved that. Clearly, you're not just stealing money. That's how you actually just take a payment, and it works from there. And so, immediately, if we look at this API resource, some things are going to become very familiar to us. So we have, for example, this idea of customers. Let me look at that first of all. So we've got customers, and let's have a look. This is a little bit cleaner and nice on Webflow's interface. You can see, without so much all of the kind of programming speak, we've got a customer object or a customer table, and that lets us essentially see who our customers are. So by doing post, we can create a new customer. By doing get, we can retrieve a specific customer. By doing post, we can update a customer. That will happen, by the way, sometimes instead of put or patch, an API will simply have you do post, except instead of doing it on the whole collection like you do here, like slash customers, to put a new record in, you'll simply post information to customers slash the ID number. So that will only post information to that specific user, and therefore it will only update their record. You can delete, you can obviously get a list of all the customers, and that will be all the customers related to your account. So you can kind of see, again, that looks pretty familiar. Let's look at this. Now, we don't know all this information, but again, it looks pretty familiar. We've got a unique ID. They do it differently from Webflow. You get cust, which is short for customer, underscore yada yada yada. It'll tell you what kind of object it is, but it's just giving you a bunch of information. You know, are they delinquent, which means they owe you money? No. What's their email address? You know, what is their default payment method? Maybe it's card, maybe it's Bitcoin. You know, what's their shipping address? You've got a ton of different stuff in there. There's shipping address there. So you can see all the different stuff. And if you look down the nav bar on the left, I can create a customer. And again, look, Curl, very familiar. You know, I can create a customer, I can put this in. You might be wondering what this is here. Why is that a U and not an H? What's a D? What's all this stuff? Well, like on Webflow, if you pop up to authentication, if you read all this, it's going to tell you how their authorization works. So if you need to authenticate via bearer, just like we did on Webflow, then you can just put a header in, you can put authorization, bearer, and then you can put that code. So if you're ever seeing something that doesn't look quite right, just go back, have a look and check it out. Now we've got customers, you can then see there's things related to customers. So you've got card. Stripe calls a card a source, i.e. a source of payment. So, you know, if I want to add a new card, if I've just taken the customer's card details and now I want to save them to that customer in Stripe, so that I can take a payment from them, then I'm going to post to the customer slash the ID slash sources, because those sources belong to that customer, they're related to them. Therefore, I can find them by going to the customer slash the customer's ID slash source, so on and so forth. This is probably looking pretty familiar, and it's worth you taking a look yourself. And again, we just have all these different fields that you can put in. You don't need to put in all of them. Very rare that you do, but you know, you've got the option to do that if you need it, and you can type, is it a credit card, is it a debit card, you know, is it a Visa, is it a MasterCard, what's the address related to the card, what's the expiration date, what's the expiration month, you know, what's the CVC, which is the 3 numbers on the back. All sorts of different stuff you can do here. And if you look up and down, Stripe does a ton of stuff. You know, it can do crypto, it can detect fraud, it can do like monthly recurring subscription payments, it can do refunds. I mean, you can do stuff like have an API that deals with your refund. So instead of you going in and dealing with it, you could build a no-code tool that links into Stripe's refund information and actually works with it from there. So there really is a ton of stuff you can do, and I'm showing you this just to show you an API that will probably one day be familiar. The good news is usually Stripe is taken care of in every no-code tool, as I said, so it's unlikely you'll spend too much time diving into it. But my assumption is going to be, if you're building an app, you're probably using Stripe, it's probably going to be a key part of your business, and therefore there's a good chance you're either going to spend time in an API like this, or you're going to use a different payment provider, most of whom do it the same way. Stripe has really set the bar for how APIs are built for payments, and therefore if you're taking any kind of payments, at some point you're going to use almost exactly this API. So take a look, check it out, and if you come along for the next video, then I am going to now try and put this to life, and what we'll do is we will use an API tool to actually insert some sort of data into our Webflow CMS. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll speak to you again soon.